Hi, welcome to Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Jeremy Daggett, Director of Harding University in Latin America and a full-time missionary in Arequipa, Peru, and someone I have had the great pleasure and blessing to call a friend for the last 15 years. Jeremy, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
So glad to be here. Thanks for the chance to be with you.
Sure thing, man. Jeremy, we've known each other since about 2008. That's right. That's 15 years, right? I went into ministry because I heard there wasn't going to be math, but that was what it was. My first interaction with you, it was really funny. Like in undergrad, I took Greek because I thought it would be fun. I was not a Bible major, and some people forget that. And I just thought, hey, this would be fun. My justification for it was I was a history major, and biblical Greek was a historical phenomenon. So why not, right? Why not do that? So I was actually in my first graduate program there for my Master's of Science in Education, back in a previous life where I thought that I was going to teach high school history and social studies. And I was in my 7th semester of Greek, which was a seminar on Paul's letter to the Romans.
That's right.
It was me and a guy named Scott and the venerable Dr. Paul Pollard. And then I heard, oh yeah, there's this other guy who's going to sit in on our class. He's had Greek 1 before. He taught himself Greek 2, and he's going to join us for Romans. And I'm sitting here thinking, what?
Well, so just to jump in, Greek 1, yes, was my first semester. I taught myself Greek 2, but Greek 3 wasn't offered in the spring semester. So I did take, with the late Dr. Neller, I took his 1 Corinthians class. So 1 Corinthians was my second semester. And then to fulfill the 3 semesters that I was required as a Bible and ministry major, Romans was my 3rd semester.
It's just so wild to me because, like people who are fans of the podcast, thank you, by the way, they know that I teach Greek 1 and Greek 2. And it's just wild to think that you taught yourself Greek 2 and then jumped into a 1 Corinthians class. I also had that class at a different time with Dr. Neller, who I think is largely responsible for a lot of my decisions. Goodness, I could go on and on about, just even that 1 year of Greek with Dr. Neller, where I had Gospel of John for Greek 3 and then 1 Corinthians Greek 4. There were just a number of things that he said to me in and around that time that I had no idea at the time that they were going to be so impactful. And yet here I am years later, having followed advice that he gave me long before I even knew it was going to be relevant for me. The Lord works in mysterious ways. But the fact that you did all that and then for your 3rd semester class jumped into what was the equivalent of my 7th semester, I was rightfully wowed by this new kid, Jeremy, in Greek 7 for me and Scott, and we had a great time. We had a great time in that class. It was a lot of fun. Jeremy, talk to us about sort of what you're doing these days. I mentioned that you're a director of one of Harding University's international programs and that you're also a missionary in Arequipa, Peru. Tell us a little bit about how you got there. If you need to start all the way in the beginning, maybe not as far as, Gospel of John in the beginning, but if you want to start off with the sort of how you got to where you are, to help us get to know you, because I think that might give us some clue, some background as to why you wrote this wrote on this very interesting topic, a theology of travel.
Yeah, let me start off just by giving a little bit of an idea of what we're actually doing here in Arequipa. And then I'm happy to sort of connect some dots in my origin story that might even show how I got to that 1 semester in 2008, where I happened to be taking 5 different classes in 5 different languages, because that was a very unlikely thing to happen just a few years before that. So I moved here with my wife, Katie, here being Arequipa, Peru, the southern part of Peru. We call this the Deep South here.
Hey now. Hey now.
way further south than wherever y'all
I
are
think
there up
Corpus
north.
Christi is halfway between Houston and Mexico, and that feels pretty far south. But I'll give you that, right? Peru is arguably deeper south.
Well, and now we take our student group, this study abroad group that we work with 3 months out of the year, to Ushuaia, which is in Tierra del Fuego, Argentina, which really is the southernmost city in the world. So I guess that's, we can,
Yeah,
maybe
that
they can
counts.
true deep south status. But
That counts.
um, we've been here for 9 years, and our work in terms of sort of ministry and discipleship is geared around a house church that we meet with, trying to connect with neighbors, families. I play soccer with several different groups of men. Our family does like a kids club. We've done marriage classes, and the idea is to share faith and to share love of neighbor in a very religious city. So Arequipa is sort of historically, at least the last 500 years, predominantly Catholic. And what we aim for is sort of to connect these questions of faith in Jesus of Nazareth with loving neighbor.
Yeah.
And so that's what we try to do in just different sorts of organic ways as we make relationships. And as we've had a couple of kids and have grown as family, that has sort of shifted in different ways. We have also a small nonprofit that is dedicated to sort of this active participation in the kingdom of God, sort of bearing fruit here in the city. And so we have a library program with public schools where we try to improve reading comprehension with teachers. I know that's an issue worldwide, but
Sure.
especially in Peru, it's very it's this very sort of deep-seated issue that connects to all sorts of other things. We have a microfinance program where we do sort of microloans and personal finance as part of this bigger picture of like holistic well-being for some marginalized communities. And a few years ago, we were asked to start directing Harding University's Latin America program.
Mhm.
And so that is now sort of this third leg or big piece of what
Yeah.
we do. But it enables us to stay, live and work, raise our family, share faith in Arequipa. But it also gives me a chance to do something I love, which is to teach university students
Yeah.
and sort of guide this this journey of faith and asking questions about God and the world and our place within God's diverse world as we're here. And
Yeah.
so we love doing that.
Hey, can I hop in real quick and ask you about something that you mentioned? When you mentioned Arequipa, I was about to ask what sort of religious background is typical to find there. You answered the question before I was able to ask it. That predominantly a Catholic influence, but for the last 500 years. Similarly, in Corpus Christi, though not for as long, we are arguably not in the Bible Belt. And like my wife and I grew up in Nashville. I like saying the buckle of the Bible Belt. We both, you and I, and my wife, and your wife too, right, Katie? She, the four of us went to Harding University. We also overlapped together at Harding School of Theology in Memphis. I mean, that's all very comfortably in that part of the world, part of the U.S. known as the Bible Belt. But in Corpus Christi, we're not in that, that kind of cultural, or geographic region, but there is still a church influence due to the Mexican cultural heritage of South Texas in general and Corpus Christi in particular. And it's largely kind of a Catholic influence. That means for us, somebody grew up Catholic, and that can mean any number of things, right? Regarding someone's participation in church and whatnot. I suspect it may be similar in Arequipa as well, but it's not so difficult for me to start a conversation about faith with someone because they have learned growing up that it's important, and it's good, and it's helpful for families and things like that. Have you noticed in Arequipa that that Catholic heritage can benefit your ministry? Has it frustrated your ministry at times? I'm just curious, real quickly, if we can kind of diverge on that for a second.
Yeah, definitely. So some of both, right? Some of both in terms of helping and frustrating. In terms of helping, just in terms of having conversations of faith, it is really easy. I can speak with a complete stranger in the back of a taxi or something like that, about faith. They see that I'm not, native to Arequipa, Peru, and
Is it that obvious?
it is somewhat obvious, even though I speak Spanish really well, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's obvious. And they say, "Why are you here?" And sometimes, especially when I'm feeling like having a good conversation, I say, "Well, I'm here searching for God." And they'll say,
Oh,
like,
dangle
"Tell me
that
more
little
about
carrot
that."
there. Yeah.
And then that just opens up in a conversation of faith where it's frustrating. I never knew I would live in a place, because I'm not a shy follower of Jesus, right? And so I never knew I would live in a place where saying I'm a Christian would be such a challenge, in the sense that here, the sort of when we start to have these questions of faith, they say, "Wait, are you a Catholic or a Christian?" And I think, well, like, what,
Uh,
what, or they say, "Are you Catholic?" And I'll say, well, in this original sense of the word Catholic, being part of the universal, Christ's universal church, like, yes, absolutely.
little
But
C,
I'm not,
little C Catholic. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I'm not a Catholic in the sense that you're thinking of. But here, because of the way church has grown, a lot of people, even just within that Catholic sphere, will think of any other sort of branch of Christian faith as being all about what it prohibits. And so they'll ask, well, what are your prohibitions? Is it
Wild.
drinking, dancing? There's missionaries that have come through preaching that you can't go to movie theaters. There's a wide spectrum of things. And
Sure.
so they'll say, what church do you belong to? And I'll say, I don't belong to a church. I follow a dead guy from 2,000 years ago that some people would say was raised to life. And they'll look at me and I'll say, Jesucristo. and they'll be like, oh, yeah, yeah. And so
that's,
what I've tried to
that's
do
a
with that is
provocative way to put it.
I just try to open up conversations of faith, as
Yeah.
opposed to sort of what the general culture here does, which is like, yeah, we all believe in God, but we're going to put everyone in their boxes and know where they go. And so
Sure. Yeah.
to throw off some of those labels and have actual enriching conversations about faith, I try to live in this gray area where people can't quite place me. Even like in a couple of hours, I'm doing a funeral here, and it's of a Catholic family, but who the daughter of the man who just passed away has been part of our house church for years, and her daughter now has been too for the last year. And instead of asking a priest to do this, like this funeral, they've asked me, and so I have this way more liturgical funeral
Sure.
sermon that I would have grown up with in Churches of Christ. But I think we try to build bridges of faith and connection. And while I don't dispute differences, very clear, distinct differences in branches of faith,
Sure. Yeah.
I never want to sacrifice what we have in common in the person and, Savior and Messiah, Jesus. And
Yeah.
so it's been an interesting learning experience for sure. And definitely a lot to say about all of that.
Yeah. Jesus had a similar way about him. The Gospel of Mark really highlights this, right? With what New Testament scholars sometimes call the messianic secret, where particularly in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus will heal somebody or he will do something that is, according to Mark, evidence of Jesus's, status as the Messiah, as God's anointed one. And then Jesus will immediately turn around and say, hey, don't tell anybody about this. Right. Just kind of right in layman's terms, right? Just be chill, right? don't go off telling everybody, because I think you put this in a good way. He chose to operate in sort of that gray space where it was difficult for people to pin him down on things, because a common way of viewing the Messiah, not the only way, but the common way of viewing the Messiah was going to be this, this warrior who would, in a in a very militaristic fashion, was going to kick out the Romans, restore the kingdom to Israel, and so on. And Jesus is, yes, the Messiah, but not that kind of Messiah. And so I like how you're doing that. It's like, yes, I'm a Christian, but I'm not going to give you the opportunity to pin me down so the conversation will end. You've kind of cleverly worked your way around that. I like that, Jeremy. I'm also not surprised, knowing what I know about you, that you would be not slippery, Shrewd, innocent as a dove, shrewd as a serpent. Is that is that fair? Would you
Yeah,
would
it's
you
just
accept that?
yeah, that's fine. It's fun to have conversations of faith, and especially from a U.S. American sort of cultural standpoint, where it's just not common, or it's not just sort of like, well, we just can't dive into sort of conversations of faith. I warn guests and students when they come here that here it's okay. It's okay to have conversations of faith, to be open about that. I think we could do a lot of good just being open and
Yeah,
about conversations of faith wherever we are, right?
yeah.
But one of my favorite things I do with students who come is I get them set up 2 or 3 with different neighbors and friends, families who host them for an evening tea. And I tell my neighbors, I say, hey, this is a Christian university. Whatever students you have into your home, ask them about their faith. and
Oh,
and I warn
yeah.
I warn my students that they're going to be asked that, but I do that because these are Catholics and agnostics and Adventists and evangelical Christians, and some who are part of our house church and others who aren't.
The people
Um,
there in Arequipa,
the,
right?
the people who are
Yeah.
hosting my
Not
students,
particularly students, yeah.
but
Although some might be.
right, but I've had conversations with all of them about faith, right? And so
Mm.
it's like there's this baseline where we've been able to talk about it, and so they can just ask the students. And now I also I don't tell my students to pretend that they don't have questions or doubts, right? I'm not asking everyone to be some, in your face evangelist. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to sort of lower the bar of this like pressure we feel when talking about faith. And that's one of the things you identify in Peru, or in this especially at least historically Catholic context. There's just more openness to at least starting that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Real quickly, and then we can get back to kind of how you got to where you are. Years ago, when we were still living in Kentucky, there was a favorite burrito restaurant, and I won't name it particularly because the manager went above and beyond his duties to be generous to us. And so I don't even know if he's still there, but we had a favorite burrito restaurant, and we were there one time. Pete, our now son, who's in second grade, he was a baby, and like he was eating rice and chips and stuff like that, and just as babies do, right? There's stuff everywhere. You were thinking 7 years later there wouldn't be as many crumbs on the floor. Au contraire. But after we finished, we cleaned him up, cleaned up the high chair, and then I got down on hands and knees and was scooping up the 100 or so grains of rice underneath his chair. And the manager came over to us. He was like, "Hey, man, you don't have to do that." It's like, I mean, we made the mess. I'd clean it up. It's not that big a deal. And he's like, "No, I mean, that's cool." I was like, "We'll do it." And I had the opportunity to say, I've always found value in treating other people the way you want to be treated. So we're going to clean this up. And it's just that little bit, right? It's just an appropriate way, because I just met the guy.
Right.
I had no way to know, if I say, well, Jesus says, is that how is he going to react with that? But if I can plant this little seed here very intentionally, well, it turns out that guy was just really impressed with, how a very small gesture of just us cleaning up after our son, that, throughout the next 5 years that we would go, once every couple months or so, whenever he was there, we'd get a free burrito, or, he would comp us chips and queso or something like that. It's like, man, it's like he didn't have to do that, but that little thing there was impressive to him enough. And I got to talk to him throughout the rest of the time, and bring up faith every now and then. And so I hope he's doing well. But it was something very small like that, where it's not threatening, it was not aggressive, it was socially appropriate, but it was enough of a gentle little push to where I think I gave something worthwhile to think about. So anyway.
Michael Frost, missiologist from Australia, has this it's really more of a little workbook. Started off as a workbook, and it's now this little book called Surprise the World. But he he says in that the first step to just being more open and sharing your faith is living questionable lives, in the sense of living lives that provoke questions.
Ah,
Okay.
I like that. Yeah.
Like getting down on your hands and knees to clean the floor, or in my sense, just living in in another country, where I stand out or I look different. But
Yeah.
it provokes these questions where then there's natural ways to say a word of faith, if
Yeah.
that's a piece of why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah. I like that. Living questionable lives. Oh, that's that's so that's so mysterious and intriguing. I really like that.
It's a good little workbook. I mean, it's less than 100 pages. It's really small, but it has some, these different habits for missional living and
Yeah.
stuff.
While you are telling us a little bit more and getting us past 2008 in your journey to where you've gotten to, I'm going to write that down. So I'll be sure to put that in the description of the episode. Michael Frost, is that right?
Yes. Yeah. A former intern said it was Michael Scott, but it was actually Michael Frost. We were doing these Instagram videos, like talking about the book that we were reading, and we just lost it when she said Michael Scott. It was great. Great.
All right. Michael Frost, at what, and his book was called Threat Level Midnight. Is that right?
Yeah. Surprise the world.
Surprise the world. Great. All right. Jeremy, fill us in with, after 2008, kind of how you got to where you are, and what prompted you to do this project that we're going to talk about here in just a moment.
Yeah. So I was born and grew up in Italy, and happened to be a son of missionaries and grandson of missionaries who had also been in Italy. And when I was 8, we moved from Italy to the United States. I spoke Italian and English. I was very comfortable in both cultures. But you fast forward another 8 years, and I was the most ethnocentric, bicultural, bilingual kid in the world, I think. You would think that, like, with multiple cultures, multiple languages, you'd be open. I was closed. I did not want to learn any other language. I really had no desire to travel anywhere except for Italy, the
Sure.
motherland.
Yeah.
And we took a group of Harding students to Italy on, call it a campaign or a mission trip, where we were visiting different churches and trying to encourage and help. And of those, there were 3 who were part of this Walton Scholars Program at Harding, where they take students from a lot of different Central American countries mostly, and they're given scholarships. And so 2 were from Mexico, one woman from Guatemala, and then 2 others who spoke Spanish. And as I watched them sort of grow and interact through Spanish into Italian, it just piqued this curiosity in me. And that was right after my junior year of high school. And so coming into senior year, I had never taken a Spanish course, but I was starting to sort of dabble because of friends that we had. And so my senior year of high school, I just started worshiping with a Spanish-speaking church in Searcy, Arkansas. And I loved it. So I just started memorizing things. I just started participating in sort of a Spanish-Italian blend until I got to Harding and started actually formally studying Spanish. But that opened up this world for me. And I think just this really important sort of curiosity that started to break me out of my own ethnocentrism, right?
Yeah.
And so that first summer, I went to Peru on a sort of a missions research trip. One of my professors and mentors, Bill Richardson, was part of, sort of had this vision of taking students to Peru and Bolivia, where missionaries from Churches of Christ had sort of spent less time in, or a fewer number had gone to. And so I went to Peru and to Bolivia, and that, again, just sort of opened up my world. And there was so much hospitality on the folks that interacted with me, especially early on when I was speaking about maybe 50-50 Spanish and Italian, as I slowly worked that out of my system. But at Harding, what that turned into then was realizing then, for my theology studies, once I started studying Greek, I realized, oh, it's not just Spanish that comes to me sort of maybe more naturally because of multiple languages. It worked with Greek too. And so, like we mentioned, by the end of first semester, just for my own curiosity, I had finished the book on, the first year Greek book, and just dove in, and ended up, I had a scholarship at Harding. I was like, I have these classes I can take somewhat for free. And so that was why in my senior year, I took a year of French, and then I was studying Hebrew. And so that semester with the 5 languages was because I had one sort of Bible major class in English, and then
Sure.
a Spanish, a Greek, Hebrew, and then French class. And that, for someone who was so ethnocentric and had no desire just a few years prior, to me, that just is sort of the signs of hope that God can do all sorts of things within us to open us up to difference and diversity in the world and what we have to learn.
Yeah, real quick. I am familiar with the term ethnocentric. And when I hear that term, I kind of bristle, right? Because I know what in the academic world, I know what that means. For persons who might not, run in the academic circles that we sometimes find ourselves, what's a quick kind of working definition of ethnocentrism, and why might you say that that's something that we should maybe be careful about and overcome?
Yeah. So first, let me say what I'm about to say about ethnocentrism. I think it's normal to grow up ethnocentric. Okay. Now, so just because of we're usually sort of sheltered in our own cultural bubbles. So ethnocentrism basically means you believe your own culture is best. All right. And again, so that's why it's normal. Like we believe sort of what we've done and our cultural rules and values because it's normal to us. We believe it's best. And then we evaluate other cultures based on our own cultural values. Right.
Yeah.
And so,
I haven't seen anything wrong with this yet, Jeremy. Didn't tease him.
right. So it's very common for
Yeah,
US
yeah.
Americans to believe that, the USA is God's gift to the world. And I'm very thankful for my connections to the US, my family, and all of these things, right? But we have issues in the US, and
Very
there's
fair.
certain things, whether the culture is Italy or Peru, where I am, or Zambia, where I have to take a group of students, wherever. um, every culture has things that are positive and things that are negative, right? And it's
Yeah.
normal to sort of to only understand the world through your own culture. But what sort of my theology of travel, one of its starting points is that we grow up sort of ethnocentric in a world that God intended for diversity and for interacting through God's diverse creation. So
Yeah.
ethnocentrism, the problem isn't that it's wrong in all forms, it's natural, but it limits sort of this life as God intended it to be. And
Yeah.
so I was fine as a 16-year-old. In fact, I really loved my life as I had it. But little did I know that there was this whole world sort of waiting for me as I just had this, a little nudge in the term of in the 5 students who spoke Spanish, and then just sort of caused me to view the world a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. The the danger, or rather, the one of the things about diversity is, big buzzword, right? People are going to hear that, and depending on which way, which way you feel about it, you might either roll your eyes, or you might think, oh yeah, that's the point. It's like, well, all right, diversity, as I've seen, is inherent in the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2. God made a variety of, plants and animals and all kinds of things like that. Why? Well, God loved a diverse creation that would generate, an, a a diverse beauty, in that sort of life-giving and, peaceful and, orderly environment. Orderly in the sense that it allowed life to flourish, not orderly in like a tyrannical or authoritarian sense. And so, like, diversity, sure, yeah, of course it's a good thing. God has, God put that in the pristine created order. And the fact that we also see, we see God choosing a family, Genesis 12, but then through that family, right, the diverse nations will be blessed and will come to know through God through that family. Okay, yeah, we can see how, not just a buzzword. It is valuable. Obviously, it can be corrupted as well, right? Diversity of opinion was something that the early church, had to deal with sometimes when they said, no, 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 right? The Son's eternal. You know, there wasn't a time when the Son didn't exist. We're coming up on Christmas season, and Arius was the guy who got punched by Saint Nicholas. So, there's that. Anyway, so yeah, that makes sense to me. And the fact that, it's something that we could grow out of. You certainly had opportunities to do that and to teach your students how you've done that. Walk us through after you've, and as you've been reflecting on these experiences that you've had, just, exposure to many cultures. You mentioned Zambia earlier. Obviously, exposure to some Latin American cultures as well through the students that you got to spend some time with, of course, in Italy and the US and so on. Tell us kind of how you got to where you felt like, travel might be a key component or a key spiritual discipline for, for people to engage in.
Yeah. So I was 24 years old and in the midst of my, theology studies in seminary when Katie and I were asked to direct Harding University in Zambia. And so it's the way Harding does these programs, and there's a semester long, usually about 3 months, and you travel together, you live together, you eat together, and you do classes together. And so it's this really sort of holistic way of doing education and life and travel. And the task that we were sort of invited to carry out that semester was way above sort of like our capacity, right? It's not, we weren't experts in all of this stuff. And so, just go and do that. But it was one of these things where Katie and I had really prayed for God to close the door if it wasn't the right thing. It was, and then, fast forward. And that was after, weeks and weeks of prayer. And then, we get this approval and this official invitation to go and do this. And think, okay, well, I guess we prayed that hard. We got to say yes. And so we went to Zambia, and I had visited for just a few days a couple years prior, but I had no real sense of history from the African continent, which I've since, explored way more.
Yeah.
I had no real sense of Zambia, the country, the people. There's 64 official languages spoken within Zambia, although English is like the language that is, sort of because of 100 years of, ago of colonization, all these things, that English is the one spoken language that unites the country.
Interesting. Okay.
And so I just went as a learner, right? And I told my students, I was teaching missionary anthropology, and I was teaching a couple of other classes, but I said, hey, we're in this place as learners. There's something for us to learn. And there were some things to deconstruct there in terms of just the sort of typical, even just, I had to convince the group of students, there were 26 students, that this wasn't a mission trip, right? Because we're set up not to go and learn other places. Same with Peru and other places. We have this mentality, I'm going and I have a mission, right? And I think a starting point for our mission regardless is to go and be a learner, right? And so anyway, we were setting the stage to go and be learners. But as I was over there, because of this sharp contrast, this distinct differences between myself and my background, the Zambian people, culture, language, place, I got this sense that there's something to be learned here about God, because I'm encountering a Zambian human made in the image of God. I'm this weird sort of blend of Italian, US American image reflector of God as well. But in this space, there's something sacred that's happening that is here to teach us something about God, the world, and who we are within that. And so that was really this sort of seed, this for me, of this thesis I have of this diverse world of God's being a playground for learning and diversity and interaction, because God's image was never meant to be reflected by just one culture and one language. That's why you have from the very beginning humanity created and sent to fill the earth, right? In Genesis 1. So at the end of the story, you have the nations, every people, tribe, language, culture, family, in God's throne room worshiping. And I believe that worship isn't one uniform language. I think it's this variety. In fact, it says every language, right?
Right. Yeah. It specifies languages.
Exactly. And so anyway, that was this sort of beginning point for me. But it is, I think it's worth noting, and this is where it connects with travel, that it was the sharp difference of culture, this really distinct from Zambian culture to US American culture, that really opened this up for me, right? And really caused me sort of as a mirror to reflect on who I am, my own cultural values, but to see God in this sort of, sacred encounter, cross-culturally, interculturally. And that, so that was the starting point. Then I saw it in Italy in a different way. We got to take students. I was born and grew up in Italy, but then we got to take students, and I was a professor in Italy with the Harding group. That was my last semester, sort of my seminary studies. And then fast forward years later, we already lived for a few years in Peru when we were offered the position as directors of HULA, Harding's Latin America program. And so that's what I've started to sort of develop and really lean into.
Yeah.
Now, if we want to talk a little bit about how that's a spiritual practice, that I'd love to, because that's what I did my recent project on.
Yeah,
For my
I'm interested to know. All right, and it if it makes sense to go this route with it, that's fine. If not, then let's workshop this a little bit. As you have seen students go through these international programs, as you yourself have experienced what you've experienced, and I would assume in dialoguing with other people close to you, is there like a typical step-by-step process, not a prescriptive process, all right, where you have to do step one and then you have to go to step two, but like, is there a descriptive pattern of development that, when you see your students come, or, as you were presenting this theology of travel, like your students come with X set of presuppositions or expectations or things like that, and then they experience these things, and then that leads them to kind of question X and accept Y and be in doubt about Z, and then they go from there and gradually build something stronger. Like, is there some kind of typical pattern or process that they go through? Does that even make sense?
So I'm sure if you read my methodology chapter in this dissertation that I did, there's got to be some of that built in, because even just the
Yeah.
process requires some of that, right?
Yeah.
Eh, so sort of.
Okay.
And here's what I would say is that there's this sort of baseline starting point where, and I believe probably God's spirit creates this spark as well. But I think part of what it means to be human is to be fully human, is to be a learner. Okay. And if we're not at least open to learning something through the encounter, through travel, through study of different places and people and cultures and history, then we may not get it. So there's this starting point of recognizing there's something to learn. And I tell my students, this is class day one, I say, hey, I was late to the game. Like, you were in college, you, Kevin, were already studying history, right? I had no desire to learn history until I was in seminary, and I took my first church history class, and I thought, this is fascinating. And now I just eat history up. Now I teach history as part of the Latin American humanities. And I say, listen, some of you are there for it. Others, you have no desire to learn history, but let me tell you why I think there's something to learn here from my experience. So there's this starting point of being willing to learn. Richard Rohr and others have talked about these liminal spaces, liminal meaning these threshold moments of our life, and recognizing
almost like a
that,
transitional
and
period, right? Yeah.
a lot of cultures have like these cultural initiation rites and things. So that's a lot of studies, and it's not original to Rohr. There's others people before him doing studies on these initiation rites. But recognizing that in our US American culture, we don't have many of those sort of formal threshold moments, right? But going off to college is one. And then even that this subset of those who go off to college and then choose to study abroad, say in my context, in this Christian university, with this rich, and just to connect one more dot, my grandfather 40 plus years ago started the international programs at Harding. And so there's this, this further connection
Neat.
in terms of family history and how special it is to get to be a part of that. But they talk about these liminal moments as voluntary displacement, right? Voluntary displacement for the sake of growth and transformation.
Yeah.
And study abroad is by definition this voluntary displacement, choosing to physically go from one place to another. But now this, for the sake of transformation, isn't always clear. Some people just want to go have a good time or take great pictures, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I'm trying to lean into this voluntary displacement for the sake of growth and formation, and the fact that they would go and choose to learn in a different place from a different people is this other piece of the puzzle, right? That at least I'm leaning into as we continue on.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like this idea, Jeremy, of us, God creating us to be learners. That's something that I've been chewing on for a couple of years now. I think Adam and Eve, as they're presented there in Genesis 1, I don't think it's, I mean, it's not stated explicitly, but I think it's implied in the text. Adam and Eve were intended to learn how and grow into who God wanted them to be. I don't know that they were created and had, you know, all of the fully functioning capabilities of a rational adult who could, for example, hear what a snake in the garden was telling them and then say, you know, I'm not going to do that because X, Y, and Z will probably happen if I disobey. I think it was clear they were supposed to learn obedience. And in the process of learning obedience, right, the garden that is within Eden, the two are not synonymous. The text is clear about that. We tend to talk about them as if they're synonymous, but the garden is within Eden. I think that as they continue to learn obedience and grow in fidelity to God and grow in knowledge of God, I think that was going to be what was going to expand the borders of the garden being that hotspot of God's presence on earth. And then that gradually would be how that they were supposed to, you know, sort of fill and subdue the earth, you know, rule and have dominion over it, and so on. So I think that makes sense, that learning there is implied. Their mandate to learn is implied there in Genesis. I don't know if you do anything with that in your work, but that makes sense to me, at least.
Yeah, I love that. And I was going to ask if, you know, because that's where I start my theology of travel, my sort of what I've loved in my playground, based on another, you know, former professor, John Fortner, the best, I think to this day, the best sort of theology class I've ever had, where we spent, it was supposed to be this advanced introduction to the Old Testament, and we spent a month in Genesis 1 to 3,
I've heard
another month, you know,
that.
and so, but I have been developing, I know this gets, as we do theology, somewhat controversial, but I talk about God as learner in Genesis 1, God, obviously God omniscient, right? And but God is depicted in Genesis 1 is, you know, is speaking and is creating, but God is also seeing, separating, evaluating, right? There's all these things that God is doing, that it's almost as if God creating something, doing something new, is taking the time to sort of to evaluate it and to say, this is good. And then, you know, in the next chapter, God will say, this is not good, right?
Yeah.
And there, so obviously God can have something else sort of going on, but in Genesis 2, God is looking for this solution for the human problem of loneliness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And God, it's almost like experimenting and failing. And again, take all this with a grain of salt, the language that I'm using. But God is, you know, bringing all these animals before Adam and before the human, and it's not working, right? And then God creates a woman, right? Anyway, but then fast forward to the next chapter, and the woman, and this moment where both human beings, right? And the text is clear that both human beings are there hearing this conversation with the snake, with this tree. She sees and evaluates,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's this. There's this part of reflecting God's image, this human vocation to bear the divine image, that she's exercising, and of course, of course, fails or makes a wrong decision, right? I mean, and we see
Sure.
where that
Yeah.
goes. But my professor John Fortner would say that just being in the realm of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was giving off some sort of moral and ethical capacity that then was sort of fulfilled or consummated in the eating of the fruit, right? And then they move on into the world as moral, ethical creatures.
Mhm.
But yeah, all that to say, sorry, you just got me excited about Genesis 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
But I do think we ought to go back to those chapters. And there's so much that those early chapters of the story are doing to set up this world with this inherent capacity to teach.
Mhm.
And a God who is willing to enter that and learn, right? Experience, if we don't want to say God learns, experience at least, and truly experience alongside human beings what this new thing is. And I think that's what makes some of what this learning process sacred.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll admit, learn makes me a little uncomfortable, but because I know you, I know, I know what you're intending to say, and I like how I I I do think it's fair to say that God will, in especially Genesis 1, in both Genesis 1 and 2, that God will set back, and it almost does look like he is seeing and perceiving how things are going. And like you said, evaluating where, like he says, all right, this is good. And that is kind of his seal of approval of, okay, this is operating as it should be. These spaces are as they should be. These occupants are behaving as they should, and so forth. Yeah, I see what you mean there. Learning, the open theists who listen to this are going to be all about it. you know, I don't know about other people, but anyway, I appreciate that, and that does at least, help us see once again another way in which we are God's commissioned representatives. You're created in the image of God, and so forth. Walk us through some other things, right? Why is it that travel in particular is so valuable for this process of spiritual learning and growing?
So I I'm not positive on this, but I think I coined a term. Okay, and this what I,
Nice.
that's sort of the
Yeah.
basis of my project is intercultural spiritual formation. Okay,
All right.
um, and maybe it's out there. And again, so I wasn't
Sure.
trying to steal anyone's work. I did Google those specific terms, and there was just crickets, like nothing in those sort of
No,
combinations,
nobody's
right?
nobody's random blog showed up. So it's
But
intercultural.
intercultural spiritual formation, and that's
All right.
this type of the spirit's forming work in us, where this is just how I defined it. And again, like, you PhD guys I know are like really thoughtful and methodological and
Starting
like
with the heavy generalizations there, you people.
no, I say all this to say, like, I'm not saying what I'm about to give is the best or only definition, but at some
Sure.
point
Yeah.
you have to get the work done, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the spirit's forming work, right, in this diverse world, where your awareness of God, and awareness of God's diverse world, results in this increased capacity to know God and to know and love your neighbor, right? So it's this connection with the spiritual formation, the spirit's forming work in your life, but at this with this intercultural component. And if you think that's a stretch, just read the book of Acts, okay?
Yeah.
Where the spirit's forming work is doing so much to cross cultures and to make the message known in different language groups. Acts 2 with Pentecost, Acts 10, right, with this journey across cultures, what Rick Oster would say is to the ends of the earth,
Yeah.
and reaching out to a Gentile.
Well,
And
Acts
the
8, Jew and
spirit,
Samaritan.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
So the spirit's forming work, that's what the spirit of God does,
Yeah.
right? And so it's saying that as we travel, and if what I've said with my students is travel alone isn't enough, because there's plenty of travel happens, and
Sure.
not much formation happens,
Yeah.
okay? But it's this travel combined with theological reflection. And what
Mhm.
I ask my students to do through this humanities class that they take, and through the Bible class that is sort of a theological counterpart to this class is to reflect theologically about the God in whose world we are traveling, right? And so as we're learning about Peruvian history, and as we're traveling to, Argentina and to Chile, we're asking questions about God as we, learn about culture, and we learn the language, and we interact with the history and food and share life with people, right? And so um, it's this growth that we experience. So
Yeah.
if intercultural spiritual formation happens, it's this growth we experience through this increased awareness of God and the diversity of God's world. And it should result in loving God more, but
Mm.
also loving our neighbor more. And I want to really lean into this diverse global neighbor,
Yeah.
which is all around us. Just like it was in Acts 10,
Oh yeah.
you don't have to go anywhere to love your diverse global neighbor. The ends of the earth are right here with us, just like
Mhm.
they were for Peter and Cornelius. And the book, well, I don't have it actually. I have an ebook, but another from the author. But if we're writing any books down and show notes or anything, it's been a long time since I've read a commentary cover to cover, but it was Dr. Willie Jennings' theological commentary on the book of Acts that really developed sort of this thesis. And if you just want to read 2 chapters from it, read, his work on Acts 2 and then Acts 10. And it's this sort of, it's beautiful in
Yeah.
terms of the Spirit's work and joining and connecting across the table, and through language interaction with culture.
Yeah. I have never thought about this before until just now. And so I appreciate the generative discussion that we're having. I suspect Paul, the Apostle Paul, probably um, would not have gained such such an ability to translate the gospel cross-culturally if he had not gone on so many trips across the Mediterranean. But Paul's ability there to speak to issues in places as foreign to him as a place like Ephesus,
Mm-hmm.
and places as Roman as Philippi, places as cosmopolitan as Corinth, and places as historic as Rome itself, at least in terms of his letter. Um, his diverse his experiences with diverse cultures and cities and places like that. I can absolutely see how those experiences gave him what he needed to be able to translate the gospel in meaningful ways to people in all these different walks of life that he encountered. Yeah, that makes sense. That's not a novel not a novel observation, but that I can see how, all right, that happened to Paul, probably on a smaller scale. That might happen to me or you or anyone else who
Mm-hmm.
reflects theologically on their experiences where in some way or another they're crossing cultures. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And definitely, I want to say this because we give this sort of like glamour and privilege to travel, and it's a given. I tell my students, lean into this and soak it up for all it's worth, because you're within this small percentage in the world that gets to go to university, and an
Mhm.
even smaller subset where you get to study abroad. So, use it, soak it up for all it's worth, right? In terms of this learning potential. But you don't always get to choose when you travel, right? And there's millions of immigrants worldwide
Oh yeah. Yeah.
who often don't have a choice, or there's other factors at work in pushing them out. And what I would say there is that in a sense, that's also the story of our Bible.
Mhm.
God chooses an immigrant family, Abraham and Sarah, and says, go. So
Right.
if
Yeah.
you read those little details at the end of Genesis 11, they're immigrants and they got stuck sort of on their way somewhere else. And God's going to start out this new it's not a new mission, but this new way of extending God's blessing to all the families of the earth. And it starts out with this command to go, right?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
it's all this to say that even in all sorts of people movements, and whether it's travel by choice, there's immigration, whether it's loving our immigrant neighbor, whatever that is, there is space for the Spirit's forming work
Yeah.
to be done to form you and to form the person that you're encountering with, because that's the type of world that God has created.
Yes, sir. Jeremy, as we close here this morning, I want to say thank you so much for the conversation. Really enjoyed getting to hear about what you're doing. I'm feeling more convicted to ask my elders for a larger travel budget. No, but in all seriousness, that you know, it it helps me see that that there is more value than what I may have thought in any time that there's any sort of interaction with someone whose culture is somehow different from mine. And I don't think that that necessarily means that they have to look different from me either, right? That
Exactly.
they can just be from a different place here in the US or something along those lines. Um wrap As we wrap up here, could you give us maybe a couple of practical steps, like what is something that I could do to be a little bit more sensitive to the kinds of things that you talked to us about, or in addition to the couple of things that you've already mentioned, the book by Michael Frost, the theological commentary on Acts by Willie Jennings, are there maybe another book or two that you might recommend that might help us kind of gain some sensitivity towards these things?
Yeah, definitely. So I don't want to give any spoilers for future Faith in the Folds episodes, but there may be in a future episode, another mentor of ours speaking about this, a specific context of things going on in our world right now,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that includes suffering and hurt, and there's sort of racism, cultural difference gone wrong, right? And so
Mhm.
none of this turns, is turning away from the real hurt and challenge in our world, right? And so, um, after the attacks of September 11th in 2001, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote this book called The Dignity of Difference.
Mm.
And within that, he raises these questions. And this is, I think, just sort of a starting point for anyone that wants to take some steps along this path of intercultural spiritual formation. But he asks, can we make space for difference? Can we hear the voice of God in a language, a sensibility, a culture not our own? Can we see the presence of God in the face of a stranger, right? And so I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that was more than 20 years ago that he
Mhm.
wrote this, but his desire was to, in the face of tragedy, which was caused in a sense by some of these religious and cultural differences historically, can we come together? Can we, as people of faith, make space for difference and see God in one who is so different from us, whether it be, looking different, or whether it be culturally or linguistically or whatever? And
Yeah.
so, um, yeah, that book in itself, or even just like the first couple of chapters, is a worthy, especially in terms of now in 2023, and the conflict, right, with Israel and Palestine,
Mm.
and those difficulties. But also, then taking a step to maybe what I would say to my students: reading a history book, or inviting someone to your table, or deciding, even though with machine learning and language translation, more languages than ever are going to be more accessible to us, um, taking the opportunity to start learning another language, because it forces you through this sort of humbling process of viewing someone through the lens of their own language, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
um, so they can be little things, right? They can be little things that sort of start us off in this journey. And it's not all about just travel,
Yeah.
geographically. but becoming aware of the wonder and awe around us in God's world. And even whether it's nature, whether it's other human beings, it's this this invitation, right, to learn from God and God's world and to grow as people. And I think we can all be learners, do that a little bit better. I know that's been a long journey for myself, and I'm still growing as a learner.
Yeah. Jeremy, thank you for your time, sir. Appreciate you joining us on Faith Unfolds.
So glad to be here. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Yeah. Take care.